Okay, everybody. I think it's just gone 3:15, so we'll look at making a start again for things from there. Okay. Well, thanks very much for coming back. Final real sort of session of the day now, just to get into the final meat of the document itself, which is section 3, which deals with the RPAS operations side of things. Again, as I've mentioned before, I'm really only going to concentrate primarily on the elements that are RPAS specific, or that we feel are RPAS specific. A lot of the stuff is very, very similar, if not almost identical, to manned aviation. So there's no point covering too much detail on that. I'll touch on it in the areas, and if need to, I can always refer to the document. But we'll just concentrate on the bits that are specifically to what we're looking at. So there we are again. Section 3 then, RPAS operations, is the area that we'll be talking about for now. Annex 6 Part 4, Section 3 then has essentially 6 chapters, plus an attachment on the minimum equipment list. I'm not really going to go through that at all. It's just a set list of things. And as a quick adjustment as well, there's a further attachment or an appendix, not sure exactly what we're going to call it now, with regard to dealing with some elements of flight recorders. It was very good that the flight recorder panel offered us some text earlier on in this week, so I've attempted to put some of that into the latest draft, but it was done, that draft, and that was done before after I prepared this presentation, so it's not covered there, but we will be covering it in the text itself. And I thank the flight recorder panel for doing that for us. So the sections are basically general operating rules to start with, instruments, data and equipment as a general section on flight operations, section on performance operating limitations, maintenance, and then the remote flight crew at the end. So on to chapter 3.1 then, which is the general section to start with. Same rules as before. The bits that are darkened out or bold are the ones that I'm going to concentrate on, but of course the other sections talk about general operating rules, compliance by a foreign operator. Those are remarkably similar to or identical to what you have for a manned aircraft. We saw no need to change those, so we didn't do so. We'll touch on operation rules, and again, the surveillance of operations by a foreign operator, the carriage of dangerous goods, and the use of psychoactive substances, again, is essentially identical text to what you have for the manned aviation. I suppose at some point, philosophically, we could discuss dangerous goods at a later date, certainly for some transport operations where you could have the consideration that, given that there's nobody on board the aircraft, that it is put at risk, you might be able to move things in a different way. But that's for a later date in terms of things. For the moment, we'll stick with dangerous goods. The transport is exactly the same for international IFR operations in controlled airspace. And again, we'll talk about the security as well. So, quick touch on operating rules, which is in section 313. The bits that we've added, again, you heard me talk about VLOS and BVLOS, in other words. So there are some additional visual line of sight related points have been added into the text as well. But of course, this is only relevant if any portion of the flight that you're doing is actually involves visual line of sight. And again, the way we've been generally considering that is the possibility that you might have to do a manually or VLOS controlled either takeoff or landing. So there's points for that. Those points are really fairly obvious, actually, if you look at it, that the remote pilot or the observer has to maintain direct unaided visual contact with the aircraft. Again, fairly obvious, really, if you think about it, because if you haven't got direct unaided visual contact with the aircraft, you're not doing a VLOS operation. And secondly, for visual line of sight at night, then the RPAS must, of course, be appropriately visible so that the person flying the aircraft can see it. Again, it's not really rocket science. It's pretty obvious in terms of what's needed from there. There's also a small element in there about launch and recovery sites and all the equipment. Again, it's an acknowledgement that locations other than particular aerodromes or heliports may be possible to fly remotely piloted aircraft from. Not saying they must be, not saying they have to be, but we're not discounting that option. So if an operator or a particular RPA design involves the ability to launch from a remote site or whatever, then it can be done. So we're not discounting that as much as anything there. Details obviously included there as well as remote sites at any site involving the setup or positioning and operation of any sort of unique launch and recovery equipment that might be involved with the operation. Again, remember, we're thinking of a concept rather than a specific article or specific item or type of aircraft. So we don't want to be too tied down into what's there. So if you need extra equipment on an aerodrome or any other site to operate the aircraft, then clearly it has to be there if you need it. Also talk in this chapter about emergencies and contingencies and lost C2 link. I sort of tend to note it together, really. I think the main point to note more than anything is that there is an increased reliance, certainly with some emergency or contingency planning, on pre-planned emergency scenarios, basically due to the remote nature of the operation, and because the remote pilots can't react in the same way as they would for a traditional pilot, because they're not on board the aircraft at the time. So again, there's a human factors element to consider here with remote pilots, remotely operated aircraft. It doesn't remove human factors because there's no human on the aircraft. The human factor requirements are just placed in a slightly different place. So for example, potentially there may need to be an extended amount of pre-flight planning required prior to the flight than perhaps a traditional manned aircraft would do. Some elements you could just react at the time in the aircraft. Some things, certainly when you get down to lost C2 link, that reaction period is gone because you can only do what has been pre-planned in the operation. For the lost C2 link, which is generally what we consider as one of the major sort of unusual activities compared to a manned aircraft, then the ops manuals have to include detailed plans that mitigate the loss of C2 in terms of pre-planned and predictable manoeuvres and how they're going to be communicated to ATC. If the aircraft is equipped with an automatic collision avoidance function, then this function must be able to operate in the event of a lost C2 link. Now again, that's fairly obvious if you think of it. If the C2 link is lost and there's an automatic function that provides the collision avoidance, then clearly that needs to operate, because if it doesn't work when the C2 link is not there, then it's probably pointless having it in the first place. But what we don't want with the C2 link is suddenly an aircraft to become a dumb aircraft flying through the air over which nobody can avoid, and it can't avoid anymore. So there's considerations there to be aware of. It's a follow-on from the DAA type of thing, but automatic collision avoidance. In airspace where transponder carriage is mandatory, then the system must be capable of switching to a code which identifies that the aircraft has lost its C2 link if the link is lost as well. Note the point there, if it's in airspace where the carriage of transponders is mandatory. So again, it equates to the requirements for manned aviation in terms of what's required. But obviously, if that is required, and it can be done, then they need a form of indicating to ATC that the link has been lost so that people can react from there. Finally, in this chapter, there's an element about security as well. And I just want to point, I won't dwell on it, but point with a remote system, there is obviously an increased vulnerability with the system. So the requirements within the documents require for protection to prevent and detect from things like tampering, hacking, spoofing, or other forms of interference or malicious hijack. We don't really go too much further than that in terms of things. I'm certainly not a cyber expert, and I never claim to be, but we clearly have to accept that those threats are there, and potentially with a remote system, there is an increased threat from some elements of it, particularly through the C2 link, so we have to be aware of that. In addition, on top of that, we require increased security background checks for those involved personnel in the system, but that includes things like programming, pre-flight preparation, servicing, and of course remote piloting as well. So again, there's an increased requirement for some security checking in those areas as well. And then finally, of course, you've got to think of the remote pilot station, wherever it is, and the access control to that. Now this is potentially much more involved than, I don't want to call it simple, but forgive me for saying that, a simple locked flight deck door as it is in terms of preventing entry into the station, because ultimately there might be a large number of pilot stations within a building. You know, ultimately we could get the concept of a large remote pilot station with several other operators within it operates very similar to perhaps an air traffic control center or something like that, and it's dealing with a lot of pilots, a lot of aircraft at the same time. So the concept might be different, and of course the location of that remote pilot station might be different as well. It won't necessarily be in an airfield or in an area where it's protected. It might be somewhere else, but if it is placed in somewhere else that is vulnerable, then obviously it has to be protected from that as well. Additionally, there have to be additional verifications for non-co-located RPS during the handover. So when you get to the point of handing control to another pilot station, we'll need to have some sort of verification between that the person you're talking to is indeed the remote pilot that you expect it to be to take over that aircraft. And obviously, you're being handed the right aircraft at the same time as well. So again, a few extra little security elements to consider there. All the responsibility, of course, of the operator, because we're in an operation-centric environment, but things to consider. So there's additional bits in the document to point that out. Secondly, with instruments, data, and equipment, again, there's the list of actual chapters involved. Again, some of them are phased out. The general one, again, is fairly obvious in terms of the stuff. No surprises there. ATC communication, in terms of communicating with ATC, is all very similar. I don't want to get into more discussion or potentially about whether it goes through the C2 link or other means or whatever, but we see from there. But the pilot obviously has to communicate with ATC, and the principles for communicating with ATC are the same whether you're a manned aircraft or an unmanned aircraft. Navigation equipment, surveillance, air traffic service surveillance equipment, again, the requirements are the same. Essentially, they come to what's required for the performance-based navigation side of things and what's required for the airspace that you're flying in as well. So we don't, just because it's a remotely piloted aircraft, we don't start seeing the need for any particular differences. So the intents of things are the same. So the elements I'm going to concentrate on here in terms of equipment then are command and control link, obviously, detect and avoid, the remote pilot station, and then a little bit about some of the other RPAS components involved as well. So firstly, the C2 link. This is essentially almost the statement as it is in the SARPs anyway, that RPAS shall be equipped with a C2 link that connects the RPS and the RPA and supports the following comms tasks, which are essentially the same ones that you think when you need to operate an aircraft. So it's modifying the flight plan or the flight profile rather. Dealing with telemetry data regarding the position, the configuration, the status of the aircraft, because clearly, again, if you're in a different place, you need to know where the aircraft is, what's going on around it. Data for comms with external entities, if it's applicable. Data required for data detect and avoid capability. The flight data recording equipment requirements, which we'll touch on a little bit later as well. Supporting handovers, that's another important one in terms of things. Obviously, if you get to a point of a handover, there will be an element of a change of link at one point because you're handing over to another station. So one link will have to be rescinded at the time that the new link is established. And of course, finally, dealing with monitoring the health of that link while actually operating as well, so that you know when you're flying that everything is going okay and your link isn't about to or is about to fail. Other than that, the command and control link requirements are going to be detailed in Annex 10, so which is not part of what we're doing. So the rest of the requirements will be placed in there, but this is just an idea of what's required within our section. Detect and avoid. The requirements for conflicting traffic are intended to meet the requirements of Annex 2 and also provide the capability of the remote pilot exercising vigilance as is required in Annex 2 as well. Now, we've added a little bit in there that if the detect and avoid system or capability is also used to avoid other hazards other than conflicting aircraft, then the use of that system in avoiding other hazards and that must not cause undue hazard to other aircraft or other persons or property on the surface. So depending on what else you've got to do, it's got to work from that today. The DA has got to allow appropriate action when different hazards are present at the same time. So 2, 3, 4 hazards. There must be a way of the system being able to prioritise or enable the remote pilot to prioritise the hazards so that he or she can deal with the appropriate one at the right time. An additional one here with regard to automated hazard avoidance manoeuvres, that the remote pilot still must be able to intervene in the management of an automated hazard avoidance manoeuvre, except obviously when the C2 link is lost. And the controls and displays must be suitable in order to allow this to happen. So in other words, if there is an automated hazard avoidance or collision avoidance system, there is a facility just so that the remote pilot, while he has the link available, can retain his captaincy responsibilities, can have the ability to intervene if for whatever reason he discovers it's wrong. I personally feel that's probably very unlikely. That I suspect the detect and avoid system will have a better idea of what's happening than the remote pilot will, but we leave that just in case if there's the capability of doing it there. A little bit more about detect and avoid, because again, apart from the C2 link, probably the detect and avoid are the two key elements that are different within a remotely piloted aircraft. DA equipment must meet the appropriate airworthiness requirements, and that's done through the state of registry. So the DA equipment and the requirements themselves are an airworthiness requirement. The operator must carry out a safety risk assessment of the operations that are supported by DAA, and that's done through the state of the operator. And of course, the operator also must establish and document any operational instructions, procedures, and training requirements for the DAA equipment. Again, shouldn't be completely surprising that it's just a different set of equipment, but any equipment that is installed on an aircraft, the operator has to make sure that people involved with using it can use it properly. And again, back to the collision avoidance responsibilities, unless these can be performed in another way, to an equivalent level of safety, then the RPA must be capable of performing an automated collision avoidance manoeuvre. So there's a bit of a subtlety in there that you're not saying you have to have an automated collision avoidance capability, but if you don't have one, you have to have a really good way of filling in that gap so that you don't affect the safety of the operation completely. Okay, on to the remote pilot station then. As we said already, only one remote pilot station to one aircraft at any time. The equipment and capability of the station must be sufficient for the pilot to be able to monitor and control the operation of the RPA, deal with emergencies and communicate with ATC, etc. Again, fairly obvious, I think, from what I hope you see. If you're the pilot or the remote pilot in charge of the aircraft, you have to be able to control, monitor the aircraft and affect its flight through the air. Any additional requirements that are specified to be at the remote pilot station, it gives details of that as well. Things such as obvious stuff like manuals, charts, procedural information and that sort of thing as well. Again, the requirement that must be there available to the pilot. And also, initially, possibly you think this might be an odd one, but there has to be contingency plans because the remote location of the remote pilot station, for example, things like need to evacuate due to fire, flood, earthquake, etc., and any emergency powers and things like that, power supplies and things like that as well. So again, there's requirements around that to say that these must be in place so that the quality of service or the piloting service can continue to a reasonable event. But we have to accept that because of the location is not within the aircraft at the same time, then there are other risks involved with that aircraft, with the pilot station itself. Other RPAS components is a bit of a catch-all for a lot of the other elements within this section, really. We talk about lighting on the RPA. Again, no surprises. The lighting should be basically the same as it would be for a traditional manned aircraft because they're sharing the same airspace at the same time. So why would it be any different? Data and communications recording. Main thing probably to note here is that there will be a requirement for recording both within the aircraft and each pilot station as well. Some of that will be duplicate recording because that may well be an element that at the end of the day, if an RPA crashes somewhere, we find out what messages were transmitted or received on the aircraft and we compare that to the pilot station to what the pilot actually transmitted as well. If they're the same and it still crashed, well, we'll look for another cause. But obviously, if the messages are different, then there's an indication that something's gone wrong with the system there as well. But again, that's for further down the way in terms of accident investigation. But the elements there for recording are there. And clearly that you have to consider as well at times that some elements of the data recording may well have to be stopped at one point when you hand over from one remote pilot station to another one, that the recording for that specific flight will stop. But of course, once you've got rid of one aircraft from one pilot station, you could easily be reconfiguring it to start controlling another flight. So you have to have a natural stop in the recording somewhere to make sure that the new flight is recorded in a different way, or at least noted as being recorded in a different way. And finally, there's a little touch on there for C RPAs, as we had the example yesterday of a flying boat type operation. But again, the same additional requirements as would be required for flying boats or seaplanes and things like that. We're not sticking anything extra on top of that again. It should be the fairly obvious requirements. Okay, section 3 then is, chapter 3 rather, is the flight operations side of things. Until we had our question earlier about aerodrome operating minima, I wasn't really going to touch on the operational management side of things, but I will touch on that briefly. So again, we talk about operating facilities. Again, essentially it's the same as we'd expect from manned aviation, so we don't want to, I'm not going to waste your time here talking about duplicating that side of things, but there is information that's similar there. Operational management, I'll touch on that now. There was the question about aerodrome operating minima, and there is a small section in here which requires the operator to establish aerodrome operating minima in accordance with the criteria specified by the state of the operator for each aerodrome that's being used. Currently, as we've written it, the minima mustn't be lower than anything that's established for those aerodromes by the state of the aerodrome itself, except when specifically approved. So there is some elements about there as well. Clearly, we'll have to think of the future at some point, that there may be areas where, at the end of the day, clearly decision heights, minimum descent heights and things like that, which are linked to a manned pilot taking over visually and landing, or conducting a visual landing at the end of a flight, will or may never apply to unmanned aviation. It will obviously if you've got the point where there's a person landing the aircraft through visual line of sight. There will have to be a point at which there's a height at which that visual line of sight pilot can actually pick up the aircraft. But in the slightly more automated landing, you could argue, I suppose, it makes no difference whether the visibility is 93 million miles or the visibility is 0. The remote pilot at the end of the day can't really do much about it to affect the flight, so it's because it's all down to automatic landing systems. But again, that's a little bit more specialised, and it's something that can be considered for the future, but I think maybe we thought it was a little bit too radical to include too much detail in there at the moment. Flight preparation, again, pretty much the same as we do expect for manned aviation. Again, the only thing I will mention, and I mentioned the sort of human factors or human performance elements earlier, that when you're dealing with remote aviation, there are some elements which actually require a little bit more advanced flight planning beforehand, or potentially require a bit more planning beforehand. So that's a new human factor that we might have to consider. In-flight procedures I'll talk about in a minute, and finally there's some talk about the duties of remote pilot in command. But to be honest, other than the fact that the remote pilot in command can transfer to another person, the duties are exactly the same as a pilot in command for any other aircraft. In-flight procedures then, again, actually I'm sorry to be a bit boring, the majority of the text actually follows the same principles used for manned aviation. There is, however, some additional text added which cover the requirements for RPS handover, and that is again to another location with the associated transfer of control of the remote pilot in command duties as well. And similarly, you might want to touch on some elements of remote pilot transfer of control at the same remote pilot station. However, other than just touching on the point and bringing it to your mind, to be honest, that's really more a requirement for the operator to specify how he or she or his organisation will deal with handovers or transfers of control, depending on the type of aircraft they're operating. So we need to be aware of it, but the detail will again be in the ops manual. RPAS performance operating limitations. There's the list of contents. You see, I haven't highlighted any of those because, again, I don't really see anything particularly different from what we'd expect from a manned aircraft. There's some bits about remotely piloted aeroplanes, some about rotorcraft, depending on where we are, and also any remotely piloted aeroplanes that are certificated in accordance with the requirements of Annex 8. not really much else to say about that other than essentially the principles of manned aviation and what we already have still follow. So we got no further great details for there at the moment. Maintenance, probably a bit of a surprise again. There's really, it's an aircraft, it flies, it's piloted differently, but other than that, it has to be maintained in the same way. There is clearly subtleties about maintenance for the remote pilot station, might be slightly different from that, but in general terms, the maintenance requirements and the style and the systems and the procedures involved in maintenance are intended to be the same, because again, it flies in the same way, and we don't want to automatically change things for that. So there's a list of contents there, and there's details of SARPs within those documents, but there's nothing particularly special for me to bring on to you. Excuse me. And finally, for this section, the remote flight crew. Again, in many ways, extant principles apply in a lot of the states. The composition of the flight crew, again, the operator, or it will depend on the aircraft itself, how it's complied. Flight crew member emergency duties, flight crew member training programs and qualifications are all essentially the same principles that we have for manned aviation, and we don't want to change those. I will just touch on the designation of remote pilot in command, however. We've mentioned it already, but here's where it's stated in the document that there may be more than one remote pilot in command designated over the course of an operation, but there can only be one remote pilot in command designated at any one time. Again, fairly obvious. You don't have two captains of a ship or whatever when you're dealing with things. You have to have one person in charge at the time. And that is essentially it for this section. So I'll open the floor to any more questions, please. Hello, Edward.
Slide chapter 3.1.
A lot in that one, isn't there? Nearly there. Yeah, that's the one I suspect, isn't it?
Stop. Yeah. You consider security, spoofing, hacking, and so on. Do we meet double standards? This issue are prohibited to consider for VG2, but for you it is allowed.
I don't think it's double standards. I just think we've put a case in there that they have to be considered within the operation, or the operator has to consider these things. Remember, at the end of the day, it all centres on the operator and the operation itself. So the operator will have to consider that sort of thing from there. We don't go into any further detail than that. And I hear what you say, and I understand it, but it has to be referred to another group, I'm afraid.
Here, it is the question not to you, but to leadership.
Well, I'm afraid you have to make it.
Double standards.
You have to make it to the leadership in that case. We've put in what we think is sufficient and appropriate for the operations part of operating remotely piloted aircraft.
I support you. It's true. It's correct approach.
Thank you, Edward. Any further questions at all? I feel like an auctioneer now, waiting for the final thing. I can't see anything else, so good. I'll leave it at that then. Ron, do you want to? Oh, no, he's. Oh, you do. Sorry, Mark. Yeah.
Sorry, I was only going to make one very small point, which isn't a question. Your section 3.5, I think, was maintenance. One of the things that we've been talking about only today in Working Group 1 from the airworthiness perspective was maintenance of the system whilst the aircraft is in flight, which is clearly a unique, different aspect for RPAS. So I hear what you say in terms of, I think you've probably laid out those things that are common in there with everything else, but I think out of our work will come some further considerations that will probably impact on that chapter within Annex 6 as well. So I'll be interested particularly in actually the words in the text that you're proposing in that area, just to make sure that we're aligned on the in-flight maintenance thing.
Yeah, thanks. And it's a good point. I forgot to mention at the time there that is a key difference, is that if an aircraft is airborne for 40 hours or plus, then there may be elements of maintenance. Going on from that, I suppose there's also the consideration that you might be transferring it to another remote pilot station a day away from here or whatever, and that will not necessarily be fully serviceable at the time the aircraft takes off. But obviously, at the point where you come to the point where you have to hand over to that new pilot station, the new station will have to be serviceable itself. So yeah, there are a few little differences in there. I probably quite glibly suggest that they're probably things to come to us from the airworthiness side of things to advise us in terms of what we're doing. But yeah, certainly there has to be consideration of that sort of thing as well. As Ron said earlier, it does go back to, whilst we're doing the operations side of things, we have relied on or are relying on inputs from other parts of the panel as well, from the airworthiness side, detect and avoid, the C2 link elements as well. So there are lots of other people feeding in some of their SARPs into us. Some of the working groups are actually creating SARPs that cover several different annexes, so that they don't have their own annex to amend, but they're creating SARPs for lots of different ones as well. So we have to absorb that and take it in as we go along as well. But yes, certainly it's a good point that, yeah, there may be some elements required of, I don't know whether to call it routine maintenance or special maintenance while the aircraft is airborne as well. Okay, I really think that is that this time, I think. So thank you very much for your attendance. Ron, do you want to finish off at all?
Okay, thank you, Gerry. As far as we're concerned, this was the last section of Annex 6, Part 4 we wanted to present to you. Thank you for enduring with us, for those who are still here. I'll open the floor for final remarks, comments for a little while if somebody feels the need to add something to the discussions of yesterday and today already, before we start to wrap up. And as Gerry suggested already at the beginning of the meeting, we are finishing a bit early, but I don't think anybody's really worried about that. So, does anybody want to still add anything to the discussion or make a remark or what have you? So, I'm not going to say, you say it now or forever hold your peace, because we're going to seek your comments anyway, so. Okay. Well, from our perspective, it was great fun to do this. It was an interesting thing to prepare and to actually propose to the panel and the Secretariat to do something like this. I understand it's a fairly new phenomenon, and we probably have shown that not only at the standards and the technology level, but even at the rulemaking level or at the SARPs development level, RPASs are a disruptive technology. So we as a group, it was interesting to prepare. It helps us in shaping our thinking and getting our facts right and what have you. And it was, from us as the two co-rapporteurs, very interesting to see that we did receive a lot of questions. Admittedly, yesterday a bit more than today, but that was according to prediction, to be quite honest. And that it was primarily an interaction with the external experts that we deliberately invited for this meeting. So I think, from our perspective, it certainly served its purpose, and hopefully we will help the external parties that we have contacted in commenting on the documents that we will provide to you soon. And because, well, up to now it's all been within our working group with some discussions in the panel as well, but we need to reach out to the experts of the other panels as well and get your comments in and develop the document and improve it, if anything further from you, in accordance with the schedule I presented on the first day in the opening. And I've asked Leslie from the program bureau here in the Secretariat to give her perspective from the ICAO Secretariat on the concept brief. So, Leslie?
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Gerry. And thanks, Mark, for helping out. So, more than anything, what these 2 afternoons have been about is trying to get information out to other people, start understanding from other people's perspectives how all of this is developing, and to make sure that we are taking into consideration all the things that need to be taken into consideration, while still understanding that we have a really, really long way to go before there's a complete regulatory framework in place. There's still a lot of questions that have to be answered, but most importantly, we have to make sure that the right questions are being asked. So this has been part of that, by getting information out to you and getting feedback before we actually circulate the draft Annex 6 Part 4 for official comment from panels, from the Secretariat. We want you to have a little understanding of what it is that you're about to be given to review and comment on. So, having sat through the majority of these 2 afternoons, I'd say that the presenters, you've all done a great job. A lot of work has clearly gone into developing the material, and it was well presented. So thank you to Ron and Gerry and all the presenters. And thank all of you for sitting in through this, paying attention, and asking questions. But that's just the first part. We really, truly do need to have your feedback on the amendment proposals that are coming soon, because we don't want to wait until we actually try and send this out to states to find out that we've missed things or that there are consequences elsewhere that we just had not thought about yet. So please do review carefully, get us the responses, and all of that will be taken into consideration, and then we'll go through another iteration. But thank you all for your time and your support in this. Back to Ron and Gerry.
Okay, thanks very much, Leslie. Finally then, just thanks to the presenters from yesterday for all their work. Obviously, I had a day off yesterday in most of it from there. Thanks again to Mark for helping tie all the presentations together. And mainly, of course, thank you to all of you for coming, most particularly the external sort of experts from other panels and the Secretariat at the end. So thanks very much. We're looking forward to your input soon. Remember the timeline that Ron put up yesterday, that over the next year, there will be essentially 2 iterations of the draft document coming out to you, one shortly after this and another one probably early to mid-November when we've done the corrections from your first input. So there's a fair flow of work over the next year or so for you to provide your comments back to us, which will all then go to, hopefully, us meeting our target of March 2020, which is when we hand in our homework to ICAO. So thanks again for coming, and hope you have a good evening. Bye-bye.